Hey, this is Hans from Dakota Angler and Outfitter. We're going to do a series of videos on different fly tying materials and how you use them, and our first one is going to be on Marabou. I've had some questions recently from fly tyers about what type of Marabou to use for certain types of flies, and we thought we'd just run through them. It is a little bit daunting if you're just starting out, or even if you've tied for a while, because you'll see lots of different types of Marabou available in the shop. Everything from, small packages and smaller feathers like the mini Marabou or woolly bugger Marabou. Then you'll hear terms like blood quill Marabou or spay Marabou. So let's just run through some of these and look how we would use those. We'll start on the smaller end of things, the mini Marabou or chickaboo. These tend to be, as you can see here, very small feathers without a lot of length. And the Marabou, which is kind of that softer, kind of webby, nice kind of classic Marabou type feather, is going to be great for small flies like small woolly buggers, where you've got not a lot of length for the tail, but you want a lot of kind of bulk in a small feather. That's where these kind of shorter woolly bugger Marabou or mini Marabou feathers work really well, because they don't have a lot of length and they're not really pointy, but they're nice and kind of full when they're short, so you get a nice full tail for your woolly bugger or your leech pattern. You can also use those in things like a tail on a popper. You can see how this is just that nice kind of little short fluffy tail. You don't want a giant feather with these long skinny pointy fibers to try to tie that in. You'll get a lot of waste. You'll waste most of the feather when you're trying to use it for something like a woolly bugger, or even just a little tail on a nymph, or in this case even a popper. So you've got some options there, and what you want to look for when you're buying those would be something that says, woolly bugger Marabou. Both Wapsi, Hairline, and Nature Spirit all offer a woolly bugger Marabou, and they're going to be that style. Mini Marabou's slightly different. It's fairly similar to something you'll see whiting called chickaboo. And these are kind of a slightly different style of feather, but they still have that soft Marabou look. Most of these feathers nowadays come from turkeys. Chickaboo will come from a chicken, and mini Marabou often comes from a chicken as well, kind of a softer, smaller, downy feather from a chicken. You can use them a lot like a Marabou, a woolly bugger Marabou feather. They're just going to be even smaller and finer. So anytime you want like a nice sparse tail on a small fly like a leech, you might want to look at something even finer than the woolly bugger Marabou, which is just going to be a little fluffier and fuller than those mini Marabous or chickaboo feathers. Then we can just kind of look at this broader spectrum of feathers, getting away from these woolly bugger and mini Marabou feathers, and kind of what would be the general blood quill type Marabou. So blood quill Marabou comes in different sizes. You'll see blood quill Marabou used on everything from, a bigger leech type pattern where you're really accentuating the length of that tail, to articulated streamers, to steelhead flies, or even kind of smaller feathers. And there's smaller streamer flies. But there's a few different ways you can actually use that material, and that's where the sizing of the feather becomes important. And most of these feathers you're going to find just as a generic blood quill are going to be relatively short in terms of, when you look at it compared to these select plumes or spay Marabou. But they still have similar characteristics, these longer, straighter points. They still have a lot of movement, but they're not quite as fluffy as a woolly bugger Marabou feather. And here's some examples of how you might use these blood quill feathers. The standard length blood quill feathers would work fine, like on this Peanut Envy, Gallup's Peanut Envy. It creates the tail as well as the wing on a fly like this. In this leech pattern, you've got a couple of different colors of blood quill Marabou stacked over the top of one another. These are just all tied in, whether it's on this On this Peanut Envy, it's tied in a clump for the tail. It's tied in a clump for the wing. On this Leech, it's tied in a clump for the tail. Things get a little different though when you start looking at a couple of these other patterns. This is called a Platte River Spider, and then I've got a larger steelhead pattern here as well. These you're actually using, you could use a standard blood quill feather depending on how big of or how long you want your fibers of marabou to be, or in the case of like this large steelhead pattern, we might go up to a spay marabou. And what we're actually doing with the blood quill marabou in that case is actually wrapping it like a hackle. So you would have your spay marabou feather or your standard blood quill marabou, and you're just looking at the length that you can get off of the side of the feather here, and you're actually going to tie that in most often by the tip of the feather, and then we'd actually wrap those fibers around the hook, and that's what's creating the wing and body on these types of flies. So when you're palmering marabou, you're going to look for, you know, a spay marabou. You might want to tie a big pattern like this where you want a lot of length. You're going to look for the materials that are labeled spay or select plume, because you're going to get those big feathers with lots of long fibers. If you're tying smaller streamer patterns where you might be palmering, you could probably get away with just a standard blood quill marabou. So this is part of the reason it gets confusing, is you got all these different ways that you might want to use a feather, but then the feathers themselves aren't all the same. But just by knowing these differences in the sizes and the naming that goes along with those, you can get a better feel for, you know, picking the right feather for the fly that you're tying. Some other kinds of marabou to consider, you know, are just some specialty marabous, and one that's really popular is like the barred marabou, and the best barred marabou that we found is from Montana Fly Company. The barring is done very, very well. The feathers come out nicely barred, and the feathers aren't damaged. Some of the other barred marabous that we've seen, they tend to have kind of some rougher, you know, not very clean feathers, whereas these are just nice feathers. And the MFC kind of standard barred marabou they do is a blood quill type, but they also do offer some that's a little bit shorter and finer for tying woolly buggers. And those are kind of your standard marabou feathers in terms of how you might want to buy them and what you might want to use them for. And hopefully that video helped you figure out how to buy the right feather for the type of fly that you're tying. And if you have any questions, be sure to comment below, and we'll be able to, you know, delve into it a little bit deeper and help you figure it out. But thanks for watching, and we'll be back soon with more videos on how to choose fly tying materials.